Folks, welcome if you're here for the How We Think Forum. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, so please come on in, grab something to eat, find a chair. There's some seats still here in the front. Like I said, we'll get going in just a few minutes. So please, if you're in line for food, grab it, sit down as quietly as you can. Okay, thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this year's Faculty How We Think Forum here in the John Martinson Honors College. We are all thrilled to have such an amazing turnout on such a very cold January day. Before I get started, any folks who just came in, as a heads up, there are a couple of seats down front, but we've also set up HCRN 1145. It's just down around the corner as an overflow room. They'll be showing the live stream, so you're welcome to take food and find a seat and spread out there if you would like to as well. But let's get started. So my name is Dr. Katie Jarrell. I am a clinical associate professor here in the John Martinson Honors College, where I've been since 2018, and I will be serving as today's panel moderator. Before I talk about this year's forum, there are a few folks that I would like to thank. So first off, all of the JMHC faculty and staff who had a hand in putting on this event, in particular Shireen Lavasani and Liz Bright. I'd like to thank the Hall of Music for handling all of our AV, and I'd like to give a big thank you to Taylor Quinn, who is our student liaison, who helped guide us toward questions and topics that are relevant to Purdue students. So would you please join me in thanking those folks? So again, welcome to this year's How We Think Forum. The How We Think Forum is a signature format here in the John Martinson Honors College that brings together experts from different backgrounds to discuss a common object. So that could be a book, it could be a film, a piece of art, a news article, or in this case, a data set. The purpose of this type of panel discussion is that our three fantastic speakers are going to share how their disciplinary background and lived experience shapes how they view the object, what they find interesting about it, what questions they would ask about it, and how they would go about finding out more. Then we're going to have an interdisciplinary conversation where we look for what we have in common and where we differ, with the ultimate goal of fully understanding the object's complexity, its context, and its impact on society. So in terms of what the format's going to look like, in just a few minutes, each speaker will introduce themselves and then offer their first look at the object, what it immediately makes them think about. And then I'll ask a series of questions intended to spark conversation amongst the whole panel. And now I'm saying that I'm asking the questions, but to give you a little look behind the curtain, this group of folks has met several times with our student liaison already to discuss what we feel is relevant about this object, and we've all agreed on some rough topics that we think would be interesting to cover. When there are about 10 minutes remaining, we're going to open things up to questions from the floor. I encourage you to submit questions to our Mentimeter poll. So there are handouts on all the tables that have a QR code that you can use to submit a question. There will also be a slide where you can use the QR code on the slide to submit a question. And we're going to have the microphone going around if you're brave enough to ask a question live. So that will conclude our format. Before I turn things over to our speakers, let me introduce this year's object. So this year we've chosen the Unconstrained College Students data set. This was a set of long-range surveillance photos from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and it was part of a study for developing facial recognition algorithms for surveillance applications. 1,700 students and pedestrians were photographed via high-resolution camera without their knowledge. Students were not informed they were being used for training face recognition, nor was there an option to opt out of the study. According to the study's authors, the lack of consent or knowledge of participation is what provided part of the value of the data set, because it meant that faces could be captured, quote unquote, in the wild in their day-to-day format, because up until this point, largely facial recognition algorithms had been trained by scraping internet data, and those photographs were determined to be too perfect for the conditions that the algorithm needed. Ordinarily, research involving human subjects must receive Institutional Review Board, or IRB, approval, and this data set was classified as exempt because the data were collected by observing people in a public space where they had no expectation of privacy. The photos were timed to capture students in the passing period between scheduled classes when they would be walking between buildings. Cameras were positioned between 150 to 200 meters away from the students, as is shown on this image. And to put that into a perspective we might understand here at Purdue, let's see if our video, so imagine that you are in walk, stepping outside of class, and we'll see. So a camera might have been positioned to observe you from behind the engineering fountain, or even as far away as Memorial Mall. Since we're considering the full life of this data set from data acquisition to dissemination, this map shows where in the world different institutions published research that cited this data set. The data set was available from 2016 to 2019 under a license agreement, and in 2019, the data set was taken down from public access after an external source analyzed the file's metadata and made the analysis public, which the authors felt sort of ruined the applicability of the data set. So at this point, I'm going to ask our three panelists to introduce themselves, to share a little bit about their background and expertise, and then give us your first reaction to this artifact and telling us why you think that we, and by we, I mean students, faculty, staff, and the campus community at large, should care about it.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Temi Tokbe Adelie Olenlowa. I go by Dr. Temi. I am faculty here in the Honors College for now, and I am also the director of an after-school program called the Heads Up Tutoring and Life Skills Program, where I work with honor students, Purdue students, and community members to support youth learning after school. So my background is that I'm an educational psychologist. I got both my master's and bachelor's degrees here from Purdue University, and then I got my master's and my PhD from Purdue, and then my bachelor's degree in psychology from Oregon State University, which is a historically Black university in Baltimore. And so as an educational psychologist, I specialize in learning, motivation, teaching, belonging, identity development. And so it's that perspective that I'm bringing to the panel. So my initial reaction was kind of like a sense of betrayal. Thinking specifically from the lens of belonging, I was wondering why the students weren't notified or at least given an option or a route on how to opt out, how to not be a part of this study if they didn't want to. And then I was also a little bit surprised that the study was approved or even deemed exempt by the Institutional Review Board. A lot of times the IRB is responsible for thinking about how vulnerable the populations are, as well as what the risk and benefits are, and whether that outweighs the challenges that students would have to go through by agreeing or literally walking to class, and thus being in the study. So those are some of my initial reactions, but I'm excited to get into some more of the nuance as we go through the panel.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Nathan Swanson. I'm also faculty here in the Honors College, also the director of our Study Away program, so I put in a shameless QR code on the screen here. If you're still looking for something to do this summer, you're welcome to join one of our Study Away programs. In terms of my background, I studied political science and international studies as an undergrad, then went to law school. After that, decided I never wanted to read a contract or anything again, so I thought I should keep going to school. So I did my master's degree in political science during law school, and then switched into geography and did my PhD in geography. So as a geography, I study space and place. So think about how we experience place, the way that we connect our identities to place and space, the way that power operates in space, and all sorts of other sort of things that hopefully we'll explore through this panel. I was told we were doing first looks, and I think there's a first look slide just there. So this is the first thing I thought of a first look, is right, at least first look photos of the people take at weddings and things. And the surprise that you can see from the folks here are much the same reaction that I had to seeing this sort of data set, which was that this is really surprising. The more I thought about it, maybe it became less surprising, but initially really shocked to see this kind of research that's done on a campus, that I've spent many years on a college campus, and to see that this kind of research is going on without my knowledge. So I was quite surprised by that. Maybe not as excited as they were in the photo, but surprised nonetheless. And so my particular area of geography is feminist political geography. So in this context, I think about social differentiation, how power operates in and through space. So this really raised for me a lot of questions about how we understand the spaces around us, especially the spaces of everyday life, right? So we spend all of our time in the university space. And so what do we think about that in terms of our expectations around privacy, our identities, our belonging, our trust that we might have in the institution and these spaces that we're in. I also think a lot about maps as a geographer and particularly the idea of like critical cartography, which makes us think about who gets mapped and how people get mapped. And so this study is kind of a way of mapping us. So that raises questions about who benefits from this sort of mapping, what this mapping does in the larger sort of context, and what potential harms does it do. And then finally, of course, it's hard to separate having a background in law and not thinking about questions about rights to privacy involved in this research, the way that we think about rights differently in different spaces, and explore that a bit more as we go forward. Thank you.
Hello, folks. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, good. My name is Dr. Murish Makilavui, or Dr. M. It's a little bit easier for everybody, and I don't get as disappointed. So I'm a historian. That's my training. I did my PhD 5-6 years or so ago at this point at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I have always wanted to be a history professor. That's just what I've always wanted to do. In part, I've always found it really fascinating stories. Before I was able to really conceive of what history was as a field and as a discipline, I was always fascinated by people. Typically more kind of well-known figures who kind of captivate audiences and get people interested in these stories. And as I have gotten older, in fact, it's the stories of ordinary people that really appeal to me most. We would call that typically social histories, histories from below, as opposed to histories from above. I am a historian of migration, so I study how people move. And one of the parts of how I study history is not just understanding how people move, but also why people move and the forces that both push and pull people to different places. But also the ideas that go with people or come with people as they move and how they change as they move, whether that's moving freely or being forced to move, and how these ideas kind of translate and move with them. On the flip side of that, I also study imperialism as an idea. I'm an 18th century historian, and I study in large part the British Empire. And I'll get into it in 1 second. The image, the first look, the first thing I thought about when I thought about the first look is I'm also a big Love is Blind fan. So this is also something that, to Dr. Swanton's point, this is something that came to mind initially. But what really stands out to me is that this is both a unique image in that it's such a large data set of students who are they don't know that this is happening to them, and this is maybe such a ubiquitous image or idea historically, in part because as long as there's been one people and another people, any idea of subjugation, there have been data sets that have tracked, surveilled, monitored different types of people, trying to, in many ways, put people into neat boxes. That is part of systems of control and how power operates transhistorically. So that's the first thing that came to mind. And then the second thing that came to mind, and I'll talk a little bit about this more in a while, is how the university as a place and as an idea is often framed as something that's kind of separate from the world. That's a little insulated, it's a little cut away. But in reality, the things that happen on university campuses often reflect what's happening in the broader world. Whether that's the companies to recruit students to work for them, the protests against different political moments historically, and also the people that inhabit the university are reflective of a diverse set of people, a global population that are all coming together to kind of learn and think. So I'm looking forward to thinking about this question more with my colleagues.
Fantastic. So at this point, I am going to open up discussion among all panelists. So panelists, feel free to jump in when you have something to say. And our first question is, what do you find significant about the college campus context for this study?
I can jump in. So again, Dr. Temi, And the first thing that came to mind about like the specifics of this being on a college campus, I put my researcher hat on, and I started thinking a lot about the consent process. So I said earlier that I do research, but my research is community-based, meaning that I'm very much invested in communities and creating things alongside communities that they themselves will find beneficial. And so in this context, I guess you could consider the community that was being partnered with to be like defense industries, but from my perspective, it was students. And so I was really thinking about how consent was got from participants, and how, in a way, because of, if we went back to that visual of the map of where that would be on campus, it was kind of hard as a student to avoid that, right? If you had a class and walk, you're not gonna go out that random back door by COSI so you don't get pictured, right? It would add an extra 10 or 20 minutes to your commute. And we all know how it is at Purdue, right? You get like 10 minutes to get to class, if that. And so there was not really a possibility to opt out of this study without having some type of harm come to you. And in that case, from a researcher perspective, you could be considered a vulnerable population, meaning that you would have significant risk placed on you by participating in the study. So that could be a risk of missing out on classwork because you decided to take an alternate route. That could be the risk of you being late to work, because I know many of you are working sometimes full-time, and it might be that you're trying to get to a job, and so trying to avoid that route where the camera was, which, by the way, you wouldn't know where it was, because if you go back to that map, when you're in walk, you can't necessarily see a small lens all the way over behind the engineering fountain or in Memorial Mall. So that was a lot of the things that came up, some of the academic consequences, and as well as how this really puts a lot of the responsibility to opt out on participants. From a researcher perspective, it's really supposed to be our responsibility as the researcher to alleviate a lot of the burden on participants for joining our study, meaning that there should have been a lot of routes made clear and accessible to students to decide that they didn't want to have their photo taken or they didn't want to be a part of this database. But instead, if a student somehow found out about this because they weren't notified, they would have had to find an alternate route or use some type of facial covering or alter their clothing so that they wouldn't be able to be identified. So that's the uniqueness that I feel that comes in with the college campus context, because everyone here, ideally you care about your grades, has some type of consequence that you would suffer by joining the study, or more importantly, opting out. And then I'll get into it a little bit more later, but the research that I do is looking at how we should be holding institutions responsible for things like belonging and identity development. And in education research, we talk about how there are structures for opportunities, or opportunity structures, basically meaning that there are opportunities that universities can intentionally take to create spaces where students feel like they belong or that they're safe to develop as people. And so I feel this study in general was a missed opportunity. This could have been a chance to educate students on research, on consent, but instead, it was a missed opportunity, and it instead likely destroyed trust, did not make students feel like a valuable part of the campus, and may have also impacted their belonging.
So if I could jump in with a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So for folks who are maybe not familiar with the IRB process or sort of what researchers' obligations in that process are, could you elaborate on kind of how the IRB considers things like the power dynamics between a researcher and the population that they're studying?
Yeah, and I can reflect on a IRB that I finally got approved recently because, again, I work with a lot of vulnerable populations. So a lot of my research, for example, is with low-income housing units, with students who are living in low-income housing, as well as with populations who may not have beyond a middle or high school level of education. And so I went back and forth a lot with the IRB about how it shouldn't just be that I'm notifying people that I'm doing this study, that it needed to be a conversation, because the participants needed to have an opportunity to fully understand what they were getting themselves into, and then also have time to evaluate whether the benefits to society, to themselves, were worth the risk. And so that's why I really was focusing on consent, is because without notifying people, like, I get it, it's technically not identifiable, but anyone who has a picture of me that I didn't put on my Instagram story, I feel like is violating my privacy, especially if you didn't tell me you were taking that picture, and then, making it accessible to anyone who wanted to use the database for training purposes. So to summarize, though, to answer your question, usually the IRB process, or going through getting approval to do research, it's a process. It's not a one-off thing. And oftentimes, at least at Purdue and at my undergraduate institution, Morgan State, they encourage you to schedule meetings so that you can talk about and be challenging yourselves as a researcher to think about the benefits and how you're weighing that against what the benefits are to you as a researcher. So more of a process than like a checking the boxes type of thing.
Yeah, and so because this particular study was classified as exempt, that process would not be happening.
It still would, at least at Purdue and at my undergraduate institution. So it's important to note that the review process is different at every institution, but at Purdue, even if it's exempt, they still review it. It just means that they didn't go through the full review where people came together and went through every single piece. It's more so you were assigned one person to review it. They gave you some feedback. Maybe you went back and forth with the researcher, and then they deemed it as approved. So that would be the stark difference, is that there wasn't a convening board who reviewed this study. It was one or maybe two analysts who went through it.
Yes, thank you.
I'll jump in thinking about the question of, the college campus as a context. So one of the things that feminist geographers we think about are challenging or deconstructing perceived binaries, so that includes spatial binaries. So a very good example of this is sort of this idea of this binary between public and private space as a very popular topic among geographers. And this study provides a really good example, I think, in terms of how we can think about the way that this gets challenged. The university kind of challenges this binary. And we can do that through this question of privacy, right? So in general, in the US, under US law, we don't have a presumption of privacy, or at least not a complete privacy in public space. And so, for example, if somebody's taking photos through the window into my house, there are legal repercussions for that. I have an expectation of privacy in my home. But if I'm attending, like the Boston Marathon, and I'm standing I won't be running in it, but I'll be standing at the finish line, waiting for my friend to cross the line. If I get caught, like in the photo that gets printed on the front page of the Boston Times or whatever, Boston Globe the next day, I can't complain about that. I mean, I'm in a public space, on a public event, and so I am said in U.S. law not to have a presumption of privacy in that case. The university, I think, offers a lot of interesting nuances to this idea of this private versus public binary. It is, so a place like Purdue, right, quintessentially a public space. It is a public university. At the same time, it's a lot more than that, right, especially to those of us in the room, right? It's a place where we might live. It's a place where we study. It's a place where we work. It's a place where we do, go to athletic events. It's a place where we do our own sort of activities along a wide spectrum, right? So it's much more of a complicated space than it is simply a private or public space. And so we think about what assumptions of privacy do we have in that place when it kind of is complicated in this way. So no, I don't think of being on a campus, I don't think of it being like my home, but I also don't think of it as being like I'm at the marathon or something and might get caught on a camera. It's the idea that there's photos being taken of me that, ask questions about how do we think about privacy at an institution? We're surveilled in all kinds of ways. Every time you're scanning your card and logging into computers, there's tracking like where you are. So there's like a geosurveillance of taking place of all of us all the time. So what kind of questions do we want to ask about privacy, about rights to privacy, and so on in campus? And I think how would you respond to a study like this if you found out from the video this was being done at Purdue? What would your reaction be? And how would you react to that as someone who hopefully feels, a sense of belonging in a sense that at Purdue? How would you feel in terms of the institution, how it sees you, how researchers see you, how your professors who might be doing that research see you? Does that have any effect on how you understand this space? I won't say much more other than, we can also think about this in a broader range, broader sort of histories of campuses as social laboratories, as parts of sort of networks of geosurveillance. So campuses, universities are part of surveilling social movements like anti-war movements, long histories of things like this, of surveying international students based on what they study, where they're going to class, to take part in visa and migration regimes. So there's all kinds of ways in which the university is part of kind of surveillance networks and regimes.
Yeah.
This is a good segue from Dr. Swanson in terms of what the university does. What is the university? I just want to talk about that for a few minutes. So first of all, I think universities have existed for quite a long time. but the modern university is something that's really only existed for the last 80, 90 years in its current guise, something that's kind of familiar to all of you. And this modern university is framed in lots of different interesting ways. It's framed as a space apart and separate from the broader community, from the broader world. It's designed to do so. It has very distinct boundaries, typically, lines of delineation that mark when you're on campus versus when you're off campus. It has its own police force, typically. This is a historical phenomenon since the 60s, generally. It has its own transportation system. It has its own systems of feeding all of you, of course, with dining halls. It's in many ways self-sufficient. A power plant, of course, on the south end of campus. And yet, the university is very much so a modern phenomenon in that it is very much so part of the world. So it's kind of a misnomer that it's separate. In fact, the university is such a unique space because so many of the reverberations that are happening historically or politically are also happening on university campuses, or they might be starting to be spoken about on university campuses. And there's lots of different places you see that. Dr. Swanson alluded to anti-war movements, very significant ones historically. I think about the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement from the 60s and 70s. I think about the protests against the Iraq War in the early to mid-2000s. And most recently, I think about the protests against the destruction of Gaza. All of these historical processes, political disruptions, are often reflected and evident on university campuses, sometimes more evident than in the general population. So I think that's very important to note. And I also want to point out, and this goes to the image a little bit more, the relationship between a global economy and a university. Specifically, the university is a space of contending and often competing powers, whether that's at a federal level, whether that's at a state level, whether that's a corporate interest. For many of you, as you go through your time here at Purdue, you'll see academic job fairs happening, and many of the big names will be there. Lockheed Martin will be a prominent name, the Boston Consulting Group, Palantir. All of these companies all have a significant stake in the university as an idea. So maybe it's no surprise that many of the technologies that are being created and created by and with companies such as these that enter onto campuses and recruit students, it's no wonder that the same technology is being used on campuses. And it comes to my last and final point on the university as an idea. The university is a wonderful space. So many different people from so many different parts of the world all coming together on the clock, effectively. Every 50 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes, there's movement, there's traffic throughout campus of all of these diverse people from diverse places. So it's maybe not surprising, actually, that technology such as this, facial recognition, the university as a global space is maybe the ideal place where this technology is being used. And it's also very important to note that the rights that we have, and we'll be talking a little bit in a second more about consent and participation, the rights that students have, I think that there's an implicit sense that many of the rights that students have, they're sacrosanct, that they're higher, that students on campuses have more rights than maybe the general population. They're more protected. Again, this idea of the university as a space apart. But in fact, I think that's a bit of an illusion and something that students, as they move forward and think about who they are on the university and what the university is, something to really be thought about.
Can I ask a follow-up question? And I think that you were sort of on this thread, but I was hoping to maybe have you articulate the sort of historical trajectory of this relationship between things like the rise of protest movements on campus and the relationship to sort of institutional surveillance on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. So surveillance is a huge part of this, and you go back 100 years, and you go back to the first Red Scare, 1919. Typically speaking, when there are a group of what would be considered subversive people, and this goes all the way back to the research I do when it comes to revolutionaries, radicals who are fighting against the British Empire in anti-colonial movements, surveillance is a really important way to track people, to have a sense of who they are, what their motivations are, but also, and I think this is really important, how to punish them. So absolutely, there's a through line historically, but in particular in our modern period in the last 100 years, where there's a very clear linkage between subversive groups that might have anti-state or anti-government politics, or at least critical politics of against the government being watched and monitored. So yeah.
Can I add something to that as well? On a historical note, so my graduate school institution, where I did my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and there there was an interesting example of historical surveillance that was cast as being something that was, in fact, very beneficial to the campus community, which was the first women's housing on campus. And it was set up very much like from the view of the president's house and in a sort of U shape. So there was this idea that it would be a space that was very well watched, not only by the president's house, who was at the end of that sort of U-shaped collection of buildings, but that watching each other. And so there was explicit language used about how this would protect the dignity of Southern ladies who were studying at the university. So this a form of like surveillance through the spatial structure of the university was not cast as something, oh, we're just doing this because we're doing it. It was actually sold as this benefit or talked about as this benefit to students who were there. You actually, benefit from these forms of surveillance. So, an older example.
Yeah, as a Southern lady myself, I'm not sure how I feel about it. So related but slightly different tack, all of the folks sitting at this table are researchers. And so I wanted to ask folks, so how do you as a researcher tend to think about this question of consent and participation in your own research, and how do you see that relating to this object?
Yeah, so as I shared earlier, my research is community-based, but it didn't start out that way. I've been fortunate enough to be on a lot of teams who didn't necessarily call that the form of research, but they often encouraged me to put myself in the spaces of the participants that I wanted to recruit into a study. And so we oftentimes would either be talking to the teachers at the schools that we were going to collect data from to understand what types of incentives the kids would value or what types of incentives they would value. I would be in the community understanding the context that I was going to study so that later I would understand how to design a research study around that. And so like slowly I was building up to it, but in the background it was also kind of going back to the sense of surveillance. There's this undertone, especially in the education community, about how oftentimes researchers aren't trusted outside of the university. While research is a very commonplace thing at universities, especially research institutions like Purdue, the larger community doesn't really trust researchers just because of a lot of the harm that's been done. Even if it wasn't directly to that community or to that individual, they've heard about the harm that can be done whenever researchers come in and uncover and discover things in their community, or do so without getting consent or properly explaining the ramifications of participation. And so it's been a journey of me getting to do community-based research, but the reason why I got into it is because it felt disingenuous to be going into communities, even after having maybe 1 or 2 meetings, to then say, and now I want to take from you, when I haven't really actually invested or given anything back. And so that's why I've started to develop my research lab around community-based research. And so all the researchers in my lab are required to go to the after-school program that we are doing research with and serve. So they are volunteers, they're tutors, they're mentors, they engage with the parents. And by doing that, it helps you humanize the work that you're doing so that you're not just seeing it as this is the person who has the information that I need to finish my scholarly project or to get into grad school or to complete my research deliverables for the week. It provides voices and names and stories and experiences to the context. And so that's why my study is longitudinal, and so consent isn't a one-time thing. right? Consent really starts when we're showing up regularly to build trust within the community, to show them that we're not just here to take from you, but we actually want to learn and get to know you and serve you and fulfill your needs. And so that consent starts to build up the trust. And then there's the technical consent where we ask permission. And even in that process, especially because we're usually working with kids sometimes as young as 5, we have to explain what research is and what the consequences are. Because after you build up that trust, that also opens up the door to potentially taking advantage, right? Like they could say, well, I trust Miss Katie, and because she said I should do this, I'm just gonna do it without thinking through what it might mean if you come in and now you're telling me something about what happened at home and I have to report this to Child Protective Services. And so we go through a process where it's a conversation of getting consent, and then it's a longitudinal study, so it's not a one-time thing. Just because you told me last year that you wanted to be in the study doesn't mean that a year later you still feel the same way. Or just because you said you wanted to do the survey part doesn't mean you also want to come and do the conversation, which is the focus group that we do. And so for us, consent is a long-term, ongoing, recurring process where we're explaining the implications of and the consequences of and the benefits of, because they do love getting the toys that we give them when they finish and the gift cards that their parents get to go and get groceries at Walmart. Helping them understand all of those things before they make the decision and letting them know they can make a continuous decision to change their mind, to come back, to leave. And so for me, that's how I view consent from a community-based perspective, is that it's not a one-time thing, which is why I'm consistently coming back to that point whenever it comes to this study, because consent wasn't required. And I would add that some of our study is exempt, but we still went and got consent from participants because it was so important to us that they understood what they were signing up for. So when we were preparing for this, I was saying that I wish that they had the same energy. For those of you who drive, well, I guess you're freshmen, so, well, yeah, you probably drive. Whenever you're on the highway and you're about to come up on a toll, they're like, warning, last exit before you have to pay us to be on this road. I wish they would have had that type of, at least notice to students, warning, you are entering a zone where you are going to be photographed, so that you have a chance to think about, do I actually want that to happen? So I wish they brought that same energy to the study, but with such a large scale study, I mean, there were tens of thousands of photos taken. I don't know what consent would have looked like, because the benefit of doing community-based research is that it's oftentimes on a much smaller scale. So I'm curious to hear from the rest of the panelists who might do much larger data sets or maybe not so direct human consent. What does that look like for you?
Dr. Tammy, can I jump in and just kind of point to 2 things you said that I feel really resonated with how I think about this question? The first one is a both simple and complicated one, which is how do you build trust in communities, especially communities that have maybe been left behind in one way, shape, or form, whether that's economically, racially, whatever it might be. And then the second one is an expression that you used, consent is not a one-time thing. And that really resonated with me in terms of thinking about the long and short history of consent and participation in research in this country and then globally. A lot of the framing around the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, is framed around the atrocities of the Holocaust. This is a really important context, but maybe something that doesn't get focused on or highlighted enough is the long and very significant history of experimental research done in the United States, mostly against black, brown, and politically radical populations, and there's loads of examples. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about a few of them. Maybe the most significant and one that does get spoken about maybe the most is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where over 40 years. Black participants with syphilis were told that they would be treated by the US government. They weren't, and instead they were allowed to suffer, all with the intention of learning how syphilis affects the body. There's loads of other examples. MK Ultra was a series of experiments over about 20 years, using in part hallucinogens on an unknowing population. Curiously enough, the University of Colorado Springs is quite close to the University of Denver, where a lot of these experiments were done in the 60s and 70s. The Milgram experiment, where students, and this is one part that doesn't always get narrated, that students were brought in to act as figures in an experiment where they were told to use a fictitious kind of electrical pulse on the participants unknowingly, without a kind of full disclosure given to those who are involved in the process, is another really important one. There's loads of them. These are all experimental processes and research that were done through the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the United States. They're just from this period. So I'll end just by saying one thing, and it's about rights. And this is something that really comes back to the present day. Rights are very hard won, lots of different ways, whether that's civil rights, rights to control your body, to express whom you love. These are very hard-won rights. Privacy and surveillance are part of that conversation. Very hard to win, and they're extremely easy to lose.
I'll just add very quickly to this, and just say I think about two things in this question of, as a researcher. First of those is because the example that we've talked about with the IRB, the cynical lawyer in me knows that the IRB is mainly to prevent the university from being sued. That is its primary purpose. So it may do some ethical advantages, things along the way, but actually the most ethical conversations can actually happen outside of that process, and so it's important to think beyond just the sort of institutionalized form of ethics that come through the IRB, and to think about our research, the ramifications of it, who it affects, potential consequences, that sort of thing. It's important to think outside of that process as well, because it's a limited process for a lot of reasons. And secondly, I would just say that it's important not for me to just think about that individually, but it's important for us to have broader conversations, including among our disciplines, about what ethical research is and what it looks like. So my discipline, geography, there were geographers were like the right-hand men of colonialism. They were there on the ship doing all the things to colonize the world. And so now there's, in recent decades, been a chance to try and reconcile with that history and to try to think about what it means to have an ethical discipline that does ethical research and does not cause harm. And that has to be a collective conversation as to what research, knowledge production, knowledge distribution looks like. So what sort of ethics and norms are associated with that. And that has to be a collective conversation as well.
So this will be our last panel question so that we make sure we have some time for questions from the audience. So I wanted to ask our panelists if you could if you wanted to leave us with any sort of takeaway thoughts about how this object helps us think about the future of technology or the social and ethical issues that technology raises in a broader sense.
I'm happy to start with this question. In terms of the implications, and I've spoken about it a little bit before, is about how people are surveilled, watched, datafied, and then subsequently controlled. But I actually want to switch the focus a little bit and think through how historical data sets can actually be used effectively to reclaim histories of people who might not be showing in the archive, in our kind of, these individual lives might not be present in how we think about particular histories. And I'll harken back very quickly to research that I was doing. I was a researcher on something called the Intercolonial Slave Trade Database, which was studying the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. And these ship manifests that held numbers 400 or 500 numbers of enslaved people on these ships, where they were coming from, where they were going to, all used as part of this kind of global economy of slavery. Researchers have been very savvy in turning these data sets into explorations of people's lives that were seen as chattel, and to bring to life these histories and to use these data sets in ways that were not originally intended to be used. So I just want to point to ways that technology can be used at the same time to really bring life to stories and histories of people that have been left out of global and world histories.
Yeah, I guess my final thought might be around stakeholders. You know, who is the research for? Who is the technology for? And again, asking the kind of questions about consequences of research, I think we're at a moment where we really need to think seriously and collectively And I'll put an urgency around interdisciplinary conversations as well, right? That it can't just be humanities scholars and social scientists thinking and theorizing around technology and society in like completely separate rooms and conversations from scientists and engineers who are developing and researching these. Or they need to be conversations that happen across disciplines, especially when we're thinking about ethics, we're thinking about the human effects of technologies and what those mean. So I think it's really important, thinking collectively and across disciplines. And I think this study proves that, the necessity of that.
And I would add just a reminder that the reason why we have things like institutional review boards is because researchers were violating participants' rights. And for a long time, the participants whose rights were being violated didn't have a voice. And so the nice thing about the advancements of technology, especially with social media, it increases awareness of times when rights are being violated, and that could include times when research rights are being violated by participants. And so I see technology helping us to further advocate for ourselves, for other researchers, for the things that came out of a lot of these horrible studies that Dr. M was talking about. So how can we make sure that participants are able to make informed decisions? How can we make sure that we're minimizing the harm and maximizing the benefit? And how can we fight for justice to make sure that researchers aren't just thinking about research benefits, but also how we can distribute the benefits and burdens between both researchers and participants? And so the key of this is to refocus the purpose of doing research on the participants, right? So to focus less on the advancements for society and for researchers, and instead on how we can be focused on how we can engage in research that supports participant benefit. And so I see this being an opportunity for enhancing the standards that we use to decide beyond just legally what are we required to do, but ethically and humanly and socially, how can we better support the rights and consent processes for participants.
Fantastic. And so at this point, we'll open things up to the floor for Q&A. I think there's a microphone that will be coming around if you want to ask a question live, but feel free to scan that QR code. We've already got some good questions that have come in. So I'm going to go ahead and start with one. So we have not had much of a chance to talk about that image that showed all the different parts of the world where the data had been disseminated. And so maybe we can talk about sort of the afterlife of data, so to speak. So this question is there a risk for other countries taking advantage of potentially vulnerable students or patterns they find in American universities? And so can I ask what you all think about this question of where the data was going once it was published?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the map, which, is it up there? Anyway,
I can go
was, I mean, there are a couple of things that stood out to me looking at the map, which is where the research was being downloaded and where it was being used. I mean, I think this shows, right, so, a lot of studies that were being done in China, where, of course, citizen surveillance is well documented and widespread. Israeli universities, using this data set, Israeli universities are produce research that further a military occupation, very famously. And so it just shows, I mean, where this data is being used to improve facial recognition, to further forms of oppression. So, I mean, I think that to me tells us why we need to think about the consequences of where these data sets can go and the research that's being done and what can potentially, how, even if unintended, our data might be used.
I'll jump off from that with Dr. Swanson and think just for a second about an idea that's very prevalent for historians, which is the idea of the archive. And the archive is a space where knowledge is typically kept. The data set that's been produced from the study essentially has become its own archive, and there's a lot of questions that come out of it. Who has access to this knowledge? And this is a ubiquitous question for all archives that exist. Who has access to this knowledge? How is it being used? How is it being protected? How is it being maintained? And what are some of the kind of protocols to make it either accessible to people or to limit its usage? This is a question that's really important because all of you are part of how archives are maintained and controlled broadly as an idea. So I would push all of you as students to be thinking about yourselves not just as students but also as historical actors. Who have a significant role in thinking through how this knowledge is produced, disseminated and maintained, and what the implications of it are for you as well.
And then I'll just chime in real quickly. When I see the map, I think about especially all the red and why militaries and governments are using it and what implications that has. That your image, your likeness has been shared with militaries and governments around the world. I don't have an answer to that. It's just something I wonder about.
Yeah. So a slightly provocative question here. If digital surveillance is happening everywhere online, like cookies and trackers, et cetera, why should physical surveillance be any different? And I think maybe I'll add a follow-up question to that, which is, what is the role of somebody who is at a university, either a student or a researcher, in this question of practices that are happening across governments, across industries, but and in societally overall?
I'll just jump in and say one little small thing, which is to Dr. Jarrell's follow-up question, which is the role of students, just a little bit to be thinking about this, the role of digital surveillance. And this is it, to read broadly and to be thinking about what kind of role you play politically, and to be thinking about the kind of world that you inhabit right now and how these processes might be playing out for you in maybe seemingly benign ways on first viewing, but to be thinking critically about what these processes might mean for people throughout the globe who might not have the same access to resources or rights or protections.
Yeah, I mean, I think the surveillance questions are interesting. I mean, because we have effectively, I mean, we're mapped constantly because mostly the phones that we carry around that we've like checked and without reading, right, scrolling very quickly to the bottom of like the consent for the app or for, you know, the Apple's, the terms of service or whatever, that we're zipping through just trying to get to what we're wanting to do, giving permission to all kinds of forms of surveillance. And so I think first that we should think more about those things also. But I think secondly, there's something too about the way that this data set uses the body and the way that we think about perhaps being like embodied research subjects as opposed to a phone that's tracking us. So I think that's an interesting distinction. I mean, for us to think about why that might bother us more, or what sort of questions are raised when it involves, surveillance of bodies as opposed to surveillance of objects.
Can I follow up from sort of a legal perspective? And I don't know the right term, so I'm going to hope that you do, Dr. Swanson. But it seems to be, because we've talked a lot about consent from primarily sort of an ethical standpoint, and it seems that there is a distinction between what we might consider to be ethically informed consent and legal consent, right? Where when you become a student at a university, you sign a lot of documents that say that the university can do a lot of things with your information, or when you're presented with an extremely long terms of service that nobody actually is ever going to read, they're legally consenting, but there might be ethical questions about that. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to that point too of thinking beyond the IRB. It's also thinking beyond law. Like, I mean, ethics and law are they go together, but they're also separate, right? So the law maybe encodes norms, standards, ethics, sort of, that we might want to share, but there's also questions, ethical questions, that go beyond the law. So I think in this case, yeah, we sign a lot of these things away, we read a lot of things, we give permission to a lot of things because of, you know, the law requires it, or because, you know, certain activities are required to seek our permission, and checking the box, whatever signing up form does that for them. But I think that doesn't stop us from asking the broader questions and thinking broader, like thinking more ethically about what those documents say and do, and are there protections that we want? I mean, there are protections are different around the world as well. I spend my summers in Sweden. There's a lot of protection over consumers. And so I get all these things, like whenever I go to a new website, about permissions that are much more elaborate and much more insistent than I do in the US, for example. And there's some things in the US that I'm not allowed to access in the EU, like newspaper, like my hometown newspaper, because it violates EU law because of all the data that it collects without permission. So again, geography is important from place to place, but I think, you know, these are choices, right? So we make choices about what's legal and what's not. And so we have to have the conversations, I think, outside of the law and what's required by the law to determine what kind of legal norms do we want, what kind of laws do we want protecting privacy.
And building on that, I think it also changes over time, right? Like you all remember, you used to go on sites, and sometimes I read through the consent, and I'm like, y'all been collecting this on me all these years that I've been using this service, and you're just now telling me? But they told me now, right? And so I think that as students, you all may not see yourselves as part of the solution, but you're eventually going to become the people who are developing and deciding what the standards are, right? Like I think a lot about the Me Too movement and how things before you would say is just, you gave your consent because your skirt was too short, or you gave your consent because you looked at me with those lustful eyes, right? And now, as students, as you're hearing this, you're probably thinking it's outrageous because that is not consent. And so I think that it's really important that you remember that you are part of the solution, because the ideas that you hold, the challenges that you give to your peers are gonna shape the types of professionals that you become when you go into the workplace and do have control over how your company, how your industry determines and sets standards for what is ethically and legally allowed.
Yeah, yeah. These are all social questions, right? They require social conversations. So technology has to be. We have to think through these tech questions, just like we do other kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is a great note to end on. Can everyone join me, please, in thanking our fantastic panelists today? And thank you all for coming out on this cold January day. Hope you stay warm and have a fantastic rest of your day, fantastic weekend.
Stay warm.